for the Wednesday, June 13th, Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. Item 2 on our agenda is hearing of residents. Nobody signed up. We do have a member out in the audience. Any comments? All right, next item on our agenda is the consent agenda, minutes for the May 23rd, 2018 regular meeting. Commissioners, any comments, questions?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the consent agenda.
Okay, I have a motion to approve it. A second by Mr. Greenwald. All right, any comments or questions? No, all right, call for a vote.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries 5-0. Next item, workshop discussion 4A ZC 2018-002. Hold a workshop and discussion on an amendment of Part 3, Schertz Code of Ordinances, Unified Development Code, UDC, to subsections in Articles 9 and 16 to amend certain site design standards for public water and wastewater facilities. Jennery.
Good evening, Commissioners. So after this item was presented during the last 2 meetings to your commission, we wanted to provide a courtesy workshop just so that we can ensure that we flush out all comments and concerns related to the proposed amendments, and so that if need be, we can go through line item by line item for each of the proposed amendments and have a discussion so that there aren't any outstanding items that have not been adequately addressed. So we're hopeful that after the workshop today, then the next meeting, we can actually have it on the agenda for action. So the subcommittee met with staff at the end of the last P&Z meeting, and we went through each of the proposed amendments, and we had discussed kind of what staff had in mind in terms of what was being proposed. So what was included in your packet is the revised amendments that staff has made in an effort to address some of those items of concern that your commission had expressed at the last 2 meetings. So the first item, and I presented a bullet point here just to go over each of the items that have been proposed to be amended. So the first item that was proposed to be amended was an exemption for public water and wastewater facilities to exempt such facilities from the exterior construction and design standards. We have not received any comments from your commission about this specific subsection, so we have not revised what was proposed to be amended for that. The next section is for landscaping. Earlier on, we had proposed some amendments that, based on what we had heard from your commission, we revised it further to clarify specific subsections that we are proposing to amend. So one of the comments that we had heard before was there was a concern expressed about exempting public water and wastewater facilities from all landscaping requirements altogether. And that is not staff's intent. And so what we had done after the subcommittee meeting was we looked at the landscaping section to revise the language to address very specific subsections. So the first subsection that we have revised the proposed amendment for is subsection 7.E, which is the landscaping installation requirements. In general, the requirement here for any site design standards is 9 trees per acre, and also that 20% of the area be landscaped. So the proposed amendment is to exempt public water and wastewater facilities from the 9 trees per acre requirement due to the lot sizes that are typically proposed for lift stations, for example. Previously, we had exempted from the overall landscaping requirement, but now we've modified that amendment to go specifically to subsection E for the exemption. The next subsection that was proposed to be revised was section 7.g, which is the landscaping buffer requirements for non-residential uses that are adjacent to residential uses. What we are proposing is modification to the landscaper buffer requirements so that when an 8-foot masonry fence is provided at the property boundary for such facilities, the landscape buffer and planting requirements would not apply. As we had mentioned during previous meetings, the nature of of these lift stations, for example, they are typically screened with a masonry wall, and so the buffer requirement with the tree planting and shrub requirement would be confined within the interior portion of the fencing, and so it didn't make sense to have that requirement. And so rather than having the tree planting and shrub planting requirements, if there's an 8-foot masonry fence, we are proposing that the public water and wastewater facilities do not have to plant the trees and shrubs on the interior side of these fences. That does not mean that the trees are not proposed to be planted for these sites that are adjacent to public right-of-ways. The tree planting would still occur, and that section is, the next section is 7H, landscaping. So parking area landscaping. We took a look at this section and what was previously proposed, where under subsection H, what was presented to the commission previously was an exemption from subsection H altogether. In looking at it further and communicating what our intent was with the subcommittee, we are proposing to revise that amendment to to make specific amendments under interior landscaping requirements, and then a subsection under perimeter landscaping. So as you will notice on page 2 of 5 of the proposed UDC amendments, the strike through under H there with a comment inserted where we are proposing to revise the exemption under the first paragraph of H. We're no longer proposing that, and instead we're proposing to amend subsection H1 where the interior landscaping requirements would then not apply to public water and wastewater facilities so long as an 8-foot masonry fence is provided adjacent to the property boundary. When we're looking at the additional requirements under subsection H, if you go to page 3 of 5, you'll notice there's perimeter landscaping requirements, and under 2.C, there's a perimeter landscaping requirement of 1 shade tree per 50 linear feet. As planning and engineering was reviewing these subsections, we felt that the 1 shade tree per 50 linear feet is something that we are still intending to comply with, and so we are proposing the modification to specifically to subsection 2B so that 2C is not proposed to be exempted from. Subsection 2B under perimeter landscaping, you'll notice it has to do with pardon me, I have to read this to recall which requirement this one is. So this is landscaping requirements when vehicular use areas or parking is adjacent to residential property lines. And so what we are proposing here has to do with if a masonry fence is provided at or near the property boundary, then this specific subsection would not be required for public water and wastewater facilities. And then the next section has to do with screening and fencing. During the previous two meetings, we had talked about the fencing requirements for these facilities, where the initial proposal was to allow for barbed wire fencing to occur for the facilities, and the way the language was presented by staff, I believe it created a bit of confusion, and it wasn't clear on what we were proposing for the type of barbed wire fencing. And so we are proposing to modify that language from what was previously presented to specify that 3-stranded barbed wire on top of chain link fencing would be permitted for public water and wastewater facilities, so long as it is not visible from public rights-of-way or adjacent properties. The proposed definition for public water and wastewater facilities, that still remains the same. And you'll notice under that definition, we include in there that occupiable space is not considered a part of the public water and wastewater facility. So in essence, what that means is the proposed modifications that is presented before you, those requirements are specifically to the public water and wastewater facilities, excluding office space or any other, like a break room, for example, anything that would involve facilities that are utilized by personnel. Those subject structures would still be required to comply with all of the site development design standards. And the last page, page 5 of 5, the proposed amendments there, these are actually cleanup items where staff had previously presented, and it had nothing to do with public water and wastewater facility proposed related amendments. It was a proposed amendment that had already been adopted, and then as we were going through and making additional UDC amendments, staff had accidentally reverted back to the original language, and so this is a cleanup item to revise the UDC back to what was previously approved. So what we did was, rather than putting the proposed amendments in order of the UDC code sections, we broke this out as a separate item so that there's no confusion as to these proposed amendments as it relates to public water and wastewater facilities. I'm hoping that that gives a better idea to your commission as to how we've further proposed the amendments after we had met with the subcommittee. But again, staff would like to go over with your commission each of these items if there's any further questions or any additional concerns about the proposed amendments.
All right, commissioners, questions, comments?
Well, Mr. Chairman and fellow commissioners, the subcommittee did meet after our last meeting, and the presentation that was provided was very enlightening. They had a lot of example photographs of what they were talking about. Sort of hoped you would bring that same presentation back to the rest of the guys. But the key for me was the definition. You know, we talked for quite a while, but once we got around to looking at the definition of a public water and wastewater site, and tied it into some of the things they were trying to avoid, what staff wants to do made a lot more sense. A lot of good examples. You know, for instance, we talk about the lift stations. And there's not a whole lot you can do. You know, you sink basically a well, and you put a pump in it, and then you put a wall around it. There's not much else you can do with it. There's no There may, in some cases, the interior of the wall is large enough to allow a service truck to pull in there and work, and so now you've got one parking space. And according to the current UDC, because you have a parking space, you've got to landscape it and do all these other things. And when you think about it, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Some of the other kinds of things we were looking at, if you look at the O.J. Riedel wastewater treatment plant out there, you have a lot of excuse me, you have a lot of ancillary buildings where it may not be it's a single room type structure, and I don't remember what it was used for, but again, you may have one or two parking spaces to allow the service vehicles to park next to this building, and it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have to landscape those parking spaces. I could go on, but that's the kind of thing they were talking about, and staff assured me that when we start talking about putting, let's say we put an office building out there at a water treatment plant or a wastewater treatment plant, that is would not be considered a water and wastewater facility, because it's according to the definition, it's an occupiable space that's not intended to produce or treat water. It's there as office space. Maybe Commissioner Broad can help me out here a little bit, and Commissioner Greenwald, that I think after we, and I don't know how long was that meeting. Do you remember, Kathy? An hour or so of looking at the example photographs, and again nailing down or getting a better idea of exactly what it is that they're trying to avoid. It started to make sense to me. And the final thing I want to say on where you go back to tree preservation, where they've taken out all references to water and wastewater, that's because, given the right circumstances, they're already exempt under those exemptions that we added to that ordinance several months back. So there was no need to include them again. So after spending all that time with staff and going through the amendments and exactly what they were exempting and what they were not exempting, I felt comfortable with what staff was trying to do.
Down at OJR, there's, I believe, 3 buildings that are classified as occupied space. One's the laboratory where we do our testing, which we have to do testing 3 times a day, and for everything, you name it. There's a lunchroom, which is also used as a training room, and then there's a shower room. I believe that's all that's down there, isn't it, Rich? Three buildings at the plant: the shower, meeting and lunchroom, and the
building that Nick is in, but that's a trailer.
That's a trailer.
So I think there's.
And they got.
But there's no more than 3. Yeah.
So there's only about 3 that are classified as buildings. We don't have any problem sticking trees around them or anything like that. That's not a biggie. Where we have some questions, especially here in page 2, item 2, talks about wastewater facilities. If an 8-foot masonry fence is provided at or near the property boundary. Our property is 175 acres. Who's going to pay for it?
Well,
Well,
so,
there's two properties of 170,
Yeah.
180 acres, so there's really 360, 400 acres, several miles of masonry fence.
so in this particular case, it's if off-street parking or vehicular use area abuts an adjacent residential property line. So it's not up to, it's not if it's adjacent to a residential lot. It's if it's right immediately next to the property line, then so long as an 8-foot masonry fence is provided, then the 10-foot perimeter landscape area would not be required. Did I get that right? Yes.
So I
Yeah.
guess to clarify for everybody, I guess my question is on a property like this where we have 150, 200 acres or whatever, obviously putting an 8-foot masonry fence around the perimeter of that property would be incredibly expensive, but there's probably some small portion of that property that would be required to be fencing for security purposes, for TCEQ regulations or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we have a small area, maybe an acre in size, that has to have that 8-foot fence per these regulations, what exactly are we going to require them to do in terms of landscaping or whatever? How is that type of facility fit into this proposed amendment?
So for the smaller lift stations, for example, the landscaping that would be required would be along the street frontage. The tree planting requirement would apply. So if the property is adjacent to a primary or secondary street classification according to our master thoroughfare plan, the tree planting requirement is 1 per 20 linear feet. So those facilities adjacent to primary or secondary roadway classifications has to comply with that tree planting requirement. For facilities that are adjacent to public right-of-ways other than primary or secondary, the ratio requirement would then be 1 per 50 linear feet. That is not changing, so that would still apply for those facilities. Yeah.
I think the question about the 8-foot masonry fence, it's not required around the large acreage facilities. If they did not want to provide a buffer to their neighbors, then they could build an 8-foot masonry fence. But they, by default, have a buffer because the developed portion of the facility is in this, not the very center, but it's far away from the boundaries.
In theory, several hundred feet in any direction, yeah.
So they're not exempt from the buffer. They'll have the buffer.
Okay.
If they want the exemption, they'd have to build the fence, but.
Okay.
True, right. There are TCEQ requirements that they have their certain parts of their operations buffered from adjacent facility or adjacent properties.
Okay.
That then already creates the buffer to comply with TCEQ requirements.
Okay.
Well, a question's occurred to me now that we're talking about this 8-foot masonry, and I thought that was required anytime you had commercial property abutting residential property. It required the 8-foot wall. So I'm just trying to understand here. I'm not trying to make an argument. So if I build, and again, it's real easy when we talk about the small things like the lift stations or even these water distribution facilities like up here on Live Oak. It's another story altogether when you talk about hundreds of acres for a wastewater treatment plant. And we're getting now, OJR is an existing facility, and, the way we grandfather things, but they're getting ready to build a new one out south. So, I've got several hundred acres of commercial property now abutting residential. How are they exempt from that 8-foot masonry? I mean, I understand now they're hundreds of feet away from the residential property, but I thought it was pretty clear cut that commercial residential, you build a wall.
So when there is non-residential use adjacent to adjacent to residentially zoned property or residential use property, there is an 8-foot masonry wall requirement. And in addition to the masonry wall requirement, there's also a 20-foot landscape buffer requirement, and the tree and shrub planting requirement. There's tree and shrub planting requirements within that 20-foot landscape buffer. What we are proposing to amend is not to eliminate the 8-foot masonry wall requirement. It is to modify the landscape buffer portion to eliminate the landscape buffer requirement for public water and wastewater facilities.
Right.
The 8-foot masonry wall requirement still stands.
Okay, but see, now we're back to the question over here. All right.
So,
You give it a try.
the new South Schertz plant is not adjacent to residentially zoned property.
Okay.
Property to the south that it is adjacent to is own general business. The property to the north of it, I believe, is not within the city.
All right.
So it is.
So
It's either not within the city or it's pre-development because I don't have anything north of that property.
Gotcha.
That's zoned.
It's under a development agreement.
Most likely under development agreement, correct. So they're going to come in and they don't have the masonry wall requirement at all because they are not adjacent to a residentially zoned property.
Okay, but so then let's make it a hypothetical, because the question I think is still a good question. If I've got a 200-acre tract that I'm going to put a water or wastewater facility on, I don't see the exemption to the 8-foot wall.
So there's not an exemption to the 8-foot wall,
So-
nor are we proposing one, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
So whenever we evaluate large tracts of land like that, we break them down into what we call limits of construction, which is the buildable area, because they'll come in, they'll plat the whole 150, 180 acres, whatever it is down south. They're planning on platting it all as one lot. In fact, hopefully you'll be seeing that plat next meeting, so you can kind of see this a little bit better. Yes, there are grand distances between the property boundaries and what they're building. However, if they were building directly next to an existing residential subdivision, we would limit the section of that wall as appropriate to what they're building. So it's not the whole property line, and that's not what the code calls for either. It's kind of to the limit of the use because it is appropriate. Now, in those unique situations, if they feel there is a variance hardship that's appropriate, we have a mechanism to get them through that. We don't see any, and in fact, we sat down with CCMA on Friday. Engineering and planning did, and we had a good conversation about their South Schertz plant. Walked them actually through some of these amendments that we're proposing. They were in favor of a lot of them, obviously, because they have run some variances in the past to both materials and fencing types to allow the barbed wire and do some of these different things. We don't anticipate any additional plants. So OJR, South Schertz plant, that's kind of all that we're seeing going forward for the most part. We do anticipate more lift stations. We do anticipate a couple water stations that we're actually even currently working on. Our Corbett booster station, Univray Corbett. We are proposing a masonry wall. It is adjacent to a residential floor portion of it, and we think that's the appropriate thing. I mean, it's a large acre residential. I mean, it's 15, 20 plus acres that's adjacent to it on the backside. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not a small set of homes, but that's kind of the appropriate thing to do because it is somewhat of a burden, and that's even one that's got a 300-foot water tower that's on it. So 8-foot masonry fence ain't going to do much on shielding that water tower, but what it does do is it shields the things that are lower and kind of the work that goes on.
Well, and you mentioned something that was part of the mind-changing discussion at the subcommittee, and that was that, and I kind of touched on it, I didn't use the right words, when you talk about looking at the these large scale, these large area developments, you look at them, you look at each piece of it. You don't look at it as one whole. So one of the things that came out in the subcommittee is that when we're looking, for instance, at the new wastewater treatment plant, when those building plans come in there, they're not looked at strictly as a water and wastewater. They look at each structure and what its use will be, and that's why I said earlier, based on those discussions, some of these exemptions would not apply to the office building or maybe a warehouse that they were going to build, because the way the project is evaluated, they look at it in pieces.
So, for example, at the new plant, they're proposing a little under 1,000 square feet. I think it's like 850 or 900 square feet. That's a lab and 2 restrooms that has a shower in it as well. It's a very small building. They've also talked at one point about potentially having some offices in the future, down the road, that kind of thing. Just kind of a little dream issue. Let's talk through it. And they're under the understanding of, yes, that should comply as a habitable building, but we also understand that there's equipment blower buildings out there. There's the solid waste press building that's out there. There's a number of these buildings that it doesn't make sense for us to have these requirements, you know, on top of even like the actual equipment they have there. The holding tanks, the other items that sometimes you just can't make them masonry. I think for the most part, a lot of those are concrete, but they come in all kinds of formats and fashions that are better to do this. And you'll actually see in one of the interesting things, and Kathy will back me up on this, is one of the comments that has been made previously, and that staff's also kind of said, you know, give us an opportunity to show you that we're doing the right thing here, is CCMA actually has a bunch of extra landscaping that they're doing that we told them go ahead and pull off of the site plan, because I don't want you to get held up on it because it's not a requirement at all, but they have like 100 trees almost that they're planting in a big berm section kind of down the middle of the property as a buffer, and that's their choice at their cost. There's no requirement for them to do it or anything. And I told them, I said, we don't have a requirement for any of this. So it's always best when we don't have a requirement for you not to show it, so you can irrigate it however you want, you can plant it if you choose to or not choose to, but they're committed to doing kind of this little tree section to help buffer, and it's localized for what the view from the northern neighbors would eventually see, to screen the actual plant itself.
So if I understand correctly, we weren't looking for any action on this.
No,
what you're fishing for are any remaining concerns and comments that we
Absolutely.
So let me put you on the spot right now. The question was raised about having a 500-acre tract and I've got to put a wall around it. What I've heard, and in your professional opinion, that's not something that's going to happen because of the way things are written today, and it's not something we should be concerned with.
Realistically, that's correct. Now, we're happy to evaluate that. We're happy to make that change. Staff will actually say, I mean, I think we all agree that's not a change that we're interested in proposing, because, again, one of the issues that was brought up in the subcommittee was, that's great, the staff that's up here now, who comes after us? Do they have the same interpretations and mentality that we do, so on and so forth? So understand, let's keep some items in the code to make staff kind of protect themselves as we go through this, to make sure that you are getting what we're telling you you're going to get. And so keeping that provision in there is one, because really we would like, if that situation ever came up, we'd like to look at it a different way. Whether it be some additional code amendments that are run kind of as a cause of that project, or a potential variance as necessary if it qualifies. There are a number of items in the pipeline that are going to start shaking their way out towards y'all about some of the built environment and some conversations that we're planning in the future to have some bigger scoping items to understand where planning and zoning is at, where city council's at, as far as our built environment and our standards, as we're starting to look through that. But at this point in time, yes, if we have a facility that is in close proximity to residential subdivision, they should absolutely have the masonry wall as a physical and visual barrier. Just like every other commercial project has to have.
Just for, I guess, historical purposes, this predates your tenure on planning and zoning, but the, was it the Autumn Winds nursing home, where, I don't know, how did we do that, by variance or what? But
They ran a planned development district.
That's right. Okay, we did a plan development where they did not do the 8-foot masonry wall requirement. The neighbors kept their 6-foot privacy fence, but they put in a 50-foot landscape buffer, which was quite a bit more than the 20-foot requirement.
With a heavier tree planting requirement, if my memory serves me.
This is not a concern for me, Mr. Chairman. I was just trying, I thought one of my fellow commissioners asked a question, and I just wanted to make sure it got answered, and that his concerns were met. So, I mean, I can see it. You drive up the road to Live Oak, this water distribution plant has got a masonry wall. And again, what I see in the future is we're dealing with the smaller projects. We're dealing with the lift stations, and we're dealing with the water distribution. That kind of as Bryce said, yes, CCMA is going to build a new one. That'll probably be the last one we ever deal with. So, no, you don't think so?
They'll have expansion.
No, sir. The original plant was built in 1977. It's when they got the permit for it. The plant we're building is actually just a modification of what was there to start with. Based on what the growth looks like around the local area, we're probably going to have to submit some plans here about the time we finish this one. State law requires us to file plans with TCEQ whenever we reach 75% of capacity. When we reach that, we will just flat have to come up with a set of plans.
But that would be an expansion of OJR, not a third facility.
It won't be a third facility. The process of getting a permit now, I won't live long enough.
My understanding has been that the existing facilities that we have will be the facilities. Now, yes, over time they will need to be upgraded. They'll need to be rebuilt even over time. But it's kind of, the property is designated for this. And so those people who live near it know what they moved in next to. The people who come after them will know what they moved in next to.
Yeah.
Those are not as big of an issue that we have. As the commission has seen, it's the commercial coming in directly adjacent to the residential that the residential thought, I thought this was going to be residential, and it's now changed. That's kind of not what I signed up for, and that's normally some of the sentiment we get from those residents. And thus we have, my understanding is part of the reason we have the wall requirement truly is that heavier duty item. On top of that, a masonry wall generally takes significantly less maintenance on it. And so there's not a commercial company putting in a 8-foot wooden fence that then has to be upkept and maintained, and that may be difficult depending on what business moves in there on actually enforcing that maintenance. So the masonry wall is a lot easier item that typically doesn't break down, typically doesn't need maintenance, and so it's kind of a better, more secure option.
Well, let's get back to the south plant again. The south plant, what you're going to see now, or what you guys are reviewing now, is phase 1.
Yep.
There's 4 or 5 phases. When phase 2 comes up in a couple of years, that's another building permit, right? Phase 3 is another permit. Phase 4 is another permit. If any of this UDC changes, or if the property on the north side of the plant all of a sudden goes city limits residential, all this will affect CCMA. It won't be, I think you just said, the plant's there, whatever comes later, you know it's there, so you just have to suck it up. That's not correct. Every time the plant expands or changes, it's another building permit, and the entire review of the UDC takes effect.
Yes and no. We start then getting
and
into
the same thing on OJR. OJR is expanding now. There'll be another expansion in 5 years, another building permit, more city limits of Schertz expanding. So the plants may not be affected today, but there's a good chance they'll be affected tomorrow.
Sure. And just as our, since I've been here for just over 4.5 years, well, almost 5 years, it'll be 5 years in August. Wow, it's coming up here quick, right? Just seemed like the other day. Our codes have changed significantly. We wrote all of our architectural standards since I've been here. We've rewritten them. We've run some major parking updates. I mean, that's part of the code is it's got to live with the community. And the more time and effort that we put into getting it right the first time and then constantly updating, the better code that we have and it's living. And so it's not stuck in whatever decision made 20 years ago was, because we have a different community now. And so the code needs to grow with that. So absolutely, as the plan expands, we will run into challenges, but we'll work through that. And I think that, the staff that we have now, the staff that will come after us, the commission that we have now, the commission that will come after you, same as council, we'll work through these issues. The best part is that we know that we can change the code. We can change it relatively easily. And if we just apply a lick of common sense to it, it starts making sense. Because, I'll be the first to agree with you that a 700-foot long masonry wall on a northern buffer for the South Schertz plant, it doesn't serve a purpose, to be honest.
So if I remember what you said previously, the TCEQ required buffer is enough to where G wouldn't apply to the south plant, or will G apply?
The planting of the plants, let me see what is G.
Let's say the northern property turns into residential, but the TCEQ requires a 150-foot buffer.
Yes, so the buffer is already covered in that TCEQ buffer.
So there'll be no requirement for fencing?
No additional buffer.
Okay.
I don't have a requirement that I can, so what we are proposing does not eliminate the need for a fence when currently required for that masonry wall. So the City of Schertz facilities typically are covered in masonry wall, and that has been the expectation that has been pushed down, and that's why our facilities look the way they do. CCMA has provided a number of requests on their existing OJR plant, as well as originally we're looking at filing a variance for the South Schertz plant. They're waiting to see how this all goes through, so we kind of don't run dual applications in tandem. Because they have very unique situations, which, yes, when we look at what is the purpose of that wall and what's the purpose of the buffer, as staff has explained to you, in the commercial setting adjacent to residential, or anything that is multifamily or non-residential adjacent to residential, it is to deal with the noise, sound, light, kind of those mitigatable items that commercial brings that maybe having a next-door neighbor doesn't, unless that next-door neighbor has, house parties all the time, in which case I'm sure you have the same problems as commercial. And so what we have discussed with the commission on multiple occasions, and then what we're saying now as well, is we still feel that visual barrier is necessary. Who wants to look out of their backyard and see the guts of a water facility, a sewer plant, sewer plant you probably won't see, it's too far away anyways, but a lift station, they're not particularly great-looking items unless you're into the utility-esque, I guess. We'll call it utility chic decor. But the plants are designed, and typically the way we see them in commercials, that they are on the commercial side of the fence, so there's not maintenance issues. And they serve two purposes, one of which is aesthetic appeal, so you just don't see this huge wall. The other portion is noise reduction. So that's living material that helps absorb sound, helps absorb light, typically isn't going to reflect, just kind of aids in that screening process to really cause that commercial or non-residential use to be as little of an imposition as possible on the adjacent residential. And so, yes, where we see lift stations going in adjacent to residential neighborhoods, where we see our water plants going in adjacent to residential neighborhoods, we still feel that wall is appropriate. On the big scale items, it truly is going to be a case-by-case basis, and I'm hesitant to recommend putting it in here. I would much rather say, let's wait, defer, let's cross this bridge as we get there. We've got a great relationship working with CCMA both ways, and so we foresee that continuing, and I think that's a good way to do it as we see what the expansion plant is, because if it's going to necessitate that wall, it's really a question of, is that the right spot? What is this impact that we're doing? because for the most part, as Mr. Greenwald and Mr. Bro have probably seen those plans multiple times, their plan is isolated to the southern section of that property towards the commercial with this humongous buffer to the north. And so it's maybe to the northern property line, 500-600 feet. Do you really need a wall? Does it make sense? And we look at that on a case-by-case basis as staff evaluates things. Because again, there is some amount of staff interpretation that comes into every project on every item that's UDC. We just try to be consistent in those interpretations.
We hadn't brought it up yet, but the new south plant is actually sitting on a hill. Are you going to cover that? And it's a sewer treatment plant.
I thought that whole property slopes back from the road, though.
Mm. It's
'Cause I thought the road was one of the highest elevations out there, was Trainer Hale. Because I know the very back part is in the floodplain. But
he showed it to us today. It's going to be on the hill on the top side.
well, it's not much of a hill then,
Oh,
and it probably goes down further back. But I do know the high points in that area, from what I recall, and even going out there with them a couple times. The road, I think, is like one of the highest spots is Trainer Hale, and it kind of goes back from there. And I'm sure I haven't been back all the way towards the creek, but I'm sure it goes kind of drop off as we get into the creek, riverine areas that we have in town.
Right, and I believe the more northerly portion of the property is where the higher elevation is in relation to where the plant actually, where the proposed location of the plant is going to be located.
okay. We'll see.
All right, do we have any other comments or questions? All right, so I would take it we're in,
So can I just real quick, and go ahead, Mr. Burrow.
On H, you striked out public wastewater, water and wastewater facilities. But then on the last page, under definitions, it defines, it sets apart occupiable space. So what would be the difference if that was left in on H?
So that strike through, if it's left in that specific section, it means all of H is exempt. So that includes the street trees. And while we're going to plant street trees on the city facilities, going back to want to make sure that it's in the code because we have no problem doing that.
It includes what? I'm sorry?
So the street tree requirement, which is the perimeter tree requirement, which is then in H.
Oh,
2B, 2C, sorry. Yeah, so all of that would be exempt out.
Okay, never mind.
But we don't have an issue with that because, again, one of the concerns that was brought up by the subcommittee that we talked through was it really sounds like we're devoiding these things of all landscaping, and that's not our goal. The goal really is kind of trees. We'll put occasional shrubs in as necessary, but not a requirement for that, and then grass. So they'll still have landscaping. They'll still look nice. It'll still match the streetscapes that are proposed, because most of these facilities that are going to be on roads will be on roads that have streetscape requirements for the most part, or are adjacent to PDDs that do. And we really don't want to just see a 100-foot break in the tree planting because all of a sudden you're going and then you hit a lift station and there's nothing in front of it. So I feel like the one across the street here doesn't have anything in front of it. We instead would at least have a couple shade trees.
all right, Commissioners, do we have anything else?
Sorry. So one of the items that I just want to make sure, and I'll kind of get just a nod of heads, we are on a couple tight time frames that we're trying to make on this, and I typically don't notice for City Council before we have an actual action on this. But if I get a nod of heads that y'all are comfortable making a decision at next meeting, either way, then I'll kind of go ahead and notice early so that we don't hit a 4-week gap in between P&Z and City Council.
I think we have a consensus that we're
All right.
pretty much in agreement.
That's all I'm asking for, is just action to be taken either way.
One more question for clarification. What do you mean when it says public water, wastewater facilities are allowed to be opaque?
Sure. So there is a requirement here that says that fences constructed in front yard shall be non-opaque, meaning they have to be translucent, see-through. So chain link, wrought iron, those kinds of things, they can't be opaque. And so all that we're saying is that in water and wastewater facilities, fences in the front yard can be opaque, which means that we can do the masonry wall in the front of the lift station, which technically we can't if you go on a strict interpretation of this section.
On the top of page 4 or 5, that addition, that comment, is that complete, or is that, I don't read that as a complete sentence.
Yes, so it starts on 3 of 5 on the next page back.
Yeah.
And so what it says, so the sentence just says public water and wastewater facilities. Yes, we will amend that so it's more clear. I see what you're saying now.
Yeah.
To say maybe public water and wastewater facility fences are allowed to be opaque.
Okay. There you go.
There we go.
All right. One last time. Does anybody have anything else? All right. Next item on the agenda, requests and announcements. Request by commissioners to place item on a future agenda. No one? All righty. 5B, announcements by commissioners, city and community events attended, to be attended, continuing education events attended and to be attended. Anybody? All right, just a reminder for the APA conference coming up in October. Tiffany has informed us that you have until next meeting to let her know if we're going to attend and allow the city to make pre-reservations on that. Announcements by city staff.
Since our last Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, we received one new site plan application, and it's on the corner of 3009 and IH-35 Frontage Road. It is where the current Jack in the Box facility is located. So we received a site plan application to redevelop the existing Jack in the Box site as a 7-Eleven, and it involves a 3,000 square foot convenience store with 12 fueling stations and a car wash on the westerly portion of the project site. This will require processing an SUP concurrent with the specific with a site plan that then ultimately goes to City Council for action. Thank you.
All right, with that, I believe we've concluded our agenda for the evening, so meeting will be adjourned at 6:55.